As those watching might have seen already, we're in quite a special location, surrounded by these ancient books. Could you explain to us briefly where we're at?
Yes, so we are in the old book room, the inner sanctum of the Bibliotheca Philosophica Hermetica, so the Library of Hermetic Philosophy, which is a collection that is the inspiration behind the museum, which is also where we're at, which is the Embassy of the Free Mind, which is in a magnificent canal house called the House with the Heads. So we're in the old book room of the museum, which is in a very important beautiful canal house in the heart of Amsterdam.
So, I think a great way to start this podcast and to show the significance of the place where we're at is to talk about this concept of the golden thread. Could you explain that?
Yes, so I'm a researcher in the field of Western esotericism, and so there's a academic sort of field dedicated to studying esoteric traditions, mystery traditions, and one of the sort of common ideas you encounter in research and literature in esotericism is this idea of this perennial philosophy, or also sometimes called the Prisca Theologia, which means ancient wisdom, or just simply known as the golden thread. And this is what a lot of the mystery traditions are talking about. And my field, my focus in my PhD research is on a tradition called Rosicrucianism, and they're also announcing this. They're announcing their participation in this golden thread narrative, and this is a 17th century tradition. But basically, the idea is that there is this sort of universal, pure wisdom that different traditions may have different stories about, different symbols, different representations, but fundamentally the idea is that there is a golden thread, or this perennial wisdom that is always relevant, always true, that threads through the different religions and philosophies and stories throughout history. And what you have in a lot of the books in our collection that we're surrounded by are people contributing to this narrative that, whether it's in Rosicrucianism or Kabbalah or alchemy or theosophy, one of the common, things you encounter is that they are the current representatives of this golden thread. Now, we can expand on that if we go to this history of the Renaissance, because that's when this really comes online. And I could tell that story briefly. That might give some nice historical background. So at the entrance to our museum, we have a statue of an Italian called Marsilio Ficino. Is that a name that rings any bells?
No, it doesn't.
Well, probably to some of the viewers it does, maybe. But probably the name of Medici maybe rings a bell. So, which we also have statues of in our great hall downstairs. So in the 15th century in Florence, there was this council organized by the church, an ecumenical council, and that the Medicis were present for. And there was a purpose of the council was to unite the Christian tradition again, to unite the Orthodox with the Roman Catholics, which ultimately failed. As we know, the tradition was not united in the end, but there was many speakers at this council, many lectures, and there was a delegation sent to this council from Constantinople. And one of these speakers, a philosopher called Gemistos Plethon, there's a very important book written about recently, he delivered these lectures about this Greek philosopher Plato. Probably another name you recognize.
Yes, I do, yeah.
So Cosimo was present for these lectures about Plato and the Greek philosophy, and became very interested in it, and became determined to find the books of Plato, which were not known or lost, or in some cases intentionally destroyed in the Middle Ages. And so Cosimo sent out a lot of book scouts to try to find the books of Plato, to look through monasteries and other places where these books might have been preserved. And one day, shortly after this, one of these book scouts discovers the books of Plato and delivers them to Florence and presents them to Cosimo. And Cosimo was very excited about this, because this is the arrival of the Greek philosophical tradition and the sort of wisdom of the ancients, And so it was so important to get Plato translated, because they were written in ancient Greek, of course. And that's the problem, because they could not read ancient Greek, and so they needed to get the books of Plato translated into Latin. And this was so important to the humanists in Florence at this time and to the Medicis themselves, because there was this idea in the air, shared by a lot of these people, that there was this prisca theologia, this golden thread wisdom narrative, and Plato was thought to be the oldest known source of this pure wisdom that was given directly to human beings from God at the in remote antiquity. So it was so important to get this source translated. Plato, the sort of oldest known repository of this golden thread wisdom. And so Cosimo has the books, but there is a problem. He needs to get them translated. And there's one important teacher of ancient Greek language at this time in Florence, and the brightest student of this teacher was a 19-year-old Marsilio Ficino.
Okay.
So that's where Ficino comes in. So Cosimo goes to Ficino and offers him a bunch of money, offers him a villa at Careggi to stay in, and offers him the Platonic dialogues, and says, get to work. Ficino enthusiastically accepts this offer and begins this monumental translation project of all the works of Plato into Latin. And then something unexpected happens, which is another book scout arrived to Florence shortly after Ficino begins this project, books that were evidently written by an ancient Egyptian wisdom teacher called Hermes Trismegistus. And, in the air, there was this narrative of old is gold, that was the Renaissance idea, everything modern is bad and decadent, and we need to return to these ancient classic sources. So Cosimo, realizing that this Egyptian, narrative, this philosophy came before Greek, the Greek civilization, Cosimo rushes over to Ficino and says, forget about Plato. You can get back to him later. You need to translate these Egyptian wisdom books first. And so Ficino is disrupted and begins to translate the Hermetica, this Corpus Hermeticum, the dialogues of Hermes Trismegistus. And Hermes was thought to be an even older source of this golden thread, because he predated Plato. So that was what was so important to the Medicis. And this is a really famous story you can read about. It's really such a fascinating history. A woman called Frances Yates wrote a great history of this in the 20th century. And so, in any case, Ficino completes both of these translation projects over the next several decades and introduces into Europe for the first time the Platonic philosophical tradition, the Greek tradition, and the Egyptian wisdom tradition simultaneously. And now, we think these are like the main sources for Western thought. Alfred North Whitehead, the American philosopher, said, the safest thing you can say about the European philosophical tradition is that it involves a series of footnotes to Plato. So now we see, Plato especially as a main father, source for European philosophy. But, prior to the 15th century, these were completely unknown.
Didn't Plato himself say actually as well that he got some of his knowledge from Egypt as well, from ancient Egypt?
Right. So, and I haven't read all the dialogues of Plato, but I know in one of the dialogues, I want to speculate it's the Phaedrus, but I'm not sure. There is this remark of Plato that he had journeyed to Egypt, and but in any case, this story is so important to our collection that we're surrounded by, because all of the books in the collection are in some way related to Greek thought, to Platonic thought, or Neoplatonic thought, or to earlier Egyptian wisdom, to the Hermetica. And in fact, we have the first editions of Ficino's translations just behind me, actually.
Wow. So this place is called Bibliotheca Philosophica Hermetica.
Right.
Is that because here you believe that a lot of other streams of thought came from or sparked from Hermeticism, or is that Hermeticism the most important?
So, I mean, it's a sort of umbrella term, the Hermetic tradition, And so whenever people refer to the Hermetic tradition, there are many traditions that are included in the Hermetica. So this is the Hermetic library, or a Hermetic library, but within that library, we have alchemy, Kabbalah, Theosophy, Freemasonry, Rosicrucians, mysticism, even tarot, astrology, very disparate, in many cases, totally unconnected traditions. But what they have in common is that there are a few commonalities. Actually, there's a few very important ones. And Antoine Favre, who's a great father for the study of the academic study of esoteric traditions, indicates what these commonalities are. And a few of them, just to give you an idea, are this idea of a chain, this idea of correspondences, that there are different correspondences all throughout creation. And so, for example, for the Kabbalah tradition, this would be the Sephirot, the Kabbalistic tree of life, this mystical Jewish tradition. And that's how, that's the thing that connects all levels of reality. But then if you look at, a lot of things in like the art of memory, which is also an important tradition, the works of Raymond Lull, Raymond Yoy, I was told the pronunciation, is that he clothes them in a different language. He calls them dignities. There are these sort of, it's also related to this chain of being, the great chain of being, which was the sort of dominant worldview throughout the Middle Ages, that everything's connected.
Mm-hmm.
The heavens, the planets have a sympathetic connection to us. The macrocosm, the planets, the heavens have a connection to us down here, to the microcosm, to the plants and animals and everything. And so, today is Sunday, so that's all about sun. The sun and Apollo and gold, and I don't know, a certain type of flower. And so there's a certain so the correspondence as a worldview is that, and what you have actually in a lot of our magical manuscripts and other manuscripts are lists, correspondence charts. So you'll have a list of the archangels connected to a planet, each of which is connected to a Hebrew letter, to one of the pre-Christian gods. And so they're trying to it's a sort of map, it's a metaphysical map. It's a correspondence chart. That's a commonality. Another commonality is that nature is not something inert or dead, but it's a living thing, like the earth is living, and it's a much more ecological sort of awareness about nature. And that's also common to a lot of sort of neo-pagan movements, is sacralization of nature rather than this rejection of nature as fallen, which you find in a lot of sort of Orthodox traditions. Also, another commonality is that a lot of the traditions were either intentionally kept secret from within, or they were censored by the church. There's this famous Index Librorum Prohibitorum, this famous list of prohibited books.
Okay, yes.
From the 16th century. The Catholic Church says you shouldn't go anywhere near. In many ways, this is a list of the titles in our collection. And in fact, on many of the title pages, you find people that have written Liber Prohibitus on the front page. So we're in many ways sort of the current stewards, or stewards of this narrative of the Prisca Theologia. We are trying to maintain this history.
I mean, out of all the libraries in the world, I think that out of the authors that are here, probably a disproportionate amount whose lives were ended prematurely, right? Just because they were writing things that weren't allowed at the time.
Yeah, it's, I should say that I'm not an expert in all these traditions. I focus on Rosicrucianism, but the famous example of that is Giordano Bruno, who was familiar with the Hermetica, and was active at the court of Rudolf II and a very important free thinker. He was writing, books containing really heretical ideas, that, the sun is just a star and that the universe is infinite and there's many worlds out there, really heretical stuff. And he was burnt at the stake in 1600 by the church for this, these heretical opinions. So that's a, important example. Right, so many of these people also were kicked out of their homelands. If they weren't barbecued, they were exiled. And that's also important for my research and for this house, because this house hosted a lot of these free thinkers. The famous example is in Jan Amos Comenius, a Czech Moravian teacher of language, but he was exiled. Many people were exiled.
And to come to your research, you're writing a PhD about Rosicrucianism?
Yes. So my focus for my PhD is on a sort of symbolic tradition within Rosicrucianism, but that's to put it simply. Distilling a PhD hypothesis into a sentence is always impossible. But my and maybe you already mentioned it in the introduction, but there is at the University of Amsterdam the Center for the History of Hermetic Philosophy. So that's where I'm doing the PhD. They also offer master's and bachelor's courses, but my PhD project focuses on a lot of the symbolism and intellectual history of Rosicrucianism. And we can go into Rosicrucianism if you want, but that's a very important tradition for the collection.
First thing, it is different to Freemasonry, right? It's completely separate from that.
Yes, there are some interesting overlaps. There is the earliest reference that connects both of these traditions is in the 17th century in a poem I think 1634 or so, but it mentions the Rosy Cross and the Mason Word in the same poem. So as far as I know, that's the earliest explicit connection of the traditions. And also in the Scottish Rite, Freemasonry, I think it's the 18th degree, is called the Knight of the Rose Cross. So the Freemasons acknowledge the tradition for sure, but they are separate traditions. And I just gave a lecture at a lodge, a Freemasonic lodge, a couple of days ago, and this was actually part of the discussion. And I actually spoke with someone who was initiated into the Scottish Rite, and he had mentioned, so we had an interesting discussion about this. But even within the Netherlands, there are Rosicrucian organizations, you have your Freemasonic organizations, and they occasionally, will visit, as far as I know, I'm not a initiate, I'm not a Rosicrucian, I'm not a Freemason, I'm a historian, but there are some overlap. I think they do, have discussions and things, but they are separate traditions.
So these are traditions that go back centuries, right?
Yes.
Nowadays, how much percent of it, what percentage of it would you say is still in touch with that historical tradition, and what sense of it is more just because I feel like a lot of these societies might sometimes also just be a men's club or something, so what percentage, are there still groups out there that are very much in touch with this historical tradition?
That's a really good question, actually. And on the men's club point, I heard once, especially in the U.S. context, that Freemasonry isn't so much about, mysteries or esoteric knowledge. It's really a way for men to get away from their wives for an evening and to drink beer.
Yeah.
And so it is a sort of men's club, and lodges do vary. The culture of one lodge is very different from another. So now, how much are they connected to the historical content? That's a good question. So, for example, the rituals, at least in Freemasonry, are transmitted historically, and so those don't change a tremendous amount, as far as I know. So there is a certain form for the ritual, but how much does each member, know about, the publication of the Rosicrucian manifestos, or who offered them, or the historical transmission? I don't think that's so important, and for a lot of them. Some of them are definitely really into it for sure, probably, I'm speculating. But fundamentally what the Freemasons offer are tools and an experience. There's a ritual, and it's something that has to be experienced, and it's not historical knowledge that's being, taught in that sort of way, as far as I know. And the Rosicrucians, they definitely are inspired for sure by the early history of the tradition, but they'll as far as I know, and I don't know a lot about modern Rosicrucianism, my research is focused on the 17th century, the sort of beginnings of the tradition. But as far as I know, they offer courses on, the lectures on Buddhism, or, alchemy or Sufism, and so, but Rosicrucians, even the modern ones, are a great example of a perennial current. So they very much believe in this perennial philosophy that threads through the different traditions, and that's what they're searching for.
This revolves around enlightenment, right?
I think that's a core concept for sure. Enlightenment, wisdom, knowledge, and consciousness, and there's a lot of keywords there, but enlightenment is certainly one of them.
I don't know if there's any merit to it. Is there any truth in Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry spawning from earlier Templar traditions, or how did they start? Is there any truth in that?
You hear it a lot, that the Freemasons, for example, and I'm not an expert in Freemasonry, I know a few things, but I want to first acknowledge my ignorance. I'm a historian, and I want to, because there are experts out there that really know this stuff. Henrik Bogdan is an important Scandinavian scholar of Freemasonry. Maybe some others will come to mind. Henrik Bogdan is the one that really comes to mind. But, so there was this transition between what's called operative masonry, which were the stonemason guilds of the medieval period, and now we call speculative Freemasonry. And so, for example, the stonemasons who built the cathedrals in Europe were traveling through Europe and staying at these lodges, and they would exchange craft secrets and how methods of building, and now the Templars. So this is something you come across occasionally, or I come across occasionally, that the Templar documents, whatever that means, we have the final sort of master of the Templar tradition, Jacques Molay, I think was his name,
Molay, right?
who was executed.
I've been to the place in Paris where he was burned.
Oh wow, interesting. Okay, wow.
It's right in the center, and there's all that's left is a little plaque with like a remembrance. This is the place where
okay.
Jacques Molay was.
And I think that some of the charges were related to like so-called degenerate sex practices, and
I think so. Yeah.
I don't know a lot about this, but what you hear a lot is that the Templar documents were smuggled into Scotland and then preserved, and that's where you have the birth of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. Now, I don't know how true that is, but it is one of these sort of narratives you hear a lot. But again, I refer people to the work of Henrik Bogdan and other, scholars on this. But the Templars, we had a Freemasonic group that visited some time ago, and we have a room here dedicated to the Holy Grail tradition. We have a lot of literature and some nice artifacts. And one of these, Freemasons mentioned, it all goes back to the Templars, And I didn't really probe him further on that comment. It just, I took note of it. I'm like, yeah, I need to do my homework, And then there is a great primary source. We call him Eliphas Levi, who was a very important practitioner or magician. He wrote a book called The Doctrines of Transcendental Magic, which we have rare first editions of in our room here. And he begins that book with a discussion of Jacques Molay and this whole Templar narrative that's very interesting, puzzling, and worth investigating. So that's Doctrines of Transcendental Magic. People can look into that.
You mentioned there's a room for dedicated to the Holy Grail here. I think the first work of esotericism, or the first concept of esotericism that most people are introduced to, is through the Da Vinci Code, the book and the movie. And that talks about the Holy Grail with this holy bloodline.
Right.
Could you explain something about that? Is there any truth in that, or is it more fiction than?
That's another fun question. So the Da Vinci Code book was based on another book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And that book was authored by three persons, one of them called Henry Lincoln. And Henry Lincoln was he produced a lot of the Doctor Who episodes in the 1960s. But in addition to this career, he had a side, obsession, which was to prove this narrative that let me try to get this right, that the bloodline of Jesus Christ was preserved, and I think it was Mary Magdalene, or I'm not sure the details.
They had kids together, according to
together, and they were smuggled or traveled into southern France. And this Priory of Sion secret group, secret society, was charged with preserving this secret, and then were married into the Merovingian dynasty. Okay, now
we're kings in France, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so the Holy Blood, Holy Grail book is a very thick book dedicated to trying to prove this narrative using philology and history and so forth. We have this book, and what we also have is the Henry Lincoln archive in our basement, which Dan Brown consulted for researching the Da Vinci Code novel. Now that plot I just described was the plot that Dan Brown borrowed for the Da Vinci Code book, and as far as I know, without much attribution to the authors. And actually, people were sort of nudging Henry to basically level a lawsuit at Dan Brown too, because he didn't, give credit for it. And Henry was super laid back about it. He was like, oh, it's out there, he was very relaxed about it.
So you just have to look at the sales of the Da Vinci Code to see how intriguing these stories are.
Yeah.
From an academic perspective, do you sometimes find it difficult to not let yourself get dragged along by these fantastical stories?
Well, especially when it comes to like Da Vinci Code or, The Name of the Rose, Umberto Eco, or National Treasure with Nicolas Cage, I love these stories. I'm an easy sell. I'm easy to please. But But, as a consequence of, doing the master's program and now doing the PhD and being pretty immersed in this literature, and also, hosting a lot of lectures we have, and I'm constantly surrounded by this sort of, content, it's, the opposite is kind of true. I'm very skeptical of a lot of things now that I wasn't, and so it's interesting how that works psychologically, that I have a much more resilient sort of BS detector now, and so I mean, it's like the Holy Blood, Holy Grail book that, when that was offered, because whenever someone comes out with a story like that, scholars are going to rip it apart, and the problem with that book, as far as I know, was that there was so much argumentation and hypothesizing and, leaps of faith that were taken by the authors that scholars didn't even really address it, because to do that, it would just take so much effort and research and things to actually disprove each of the claims. So it's so, but I love, being dragged along by a lot of the content and stuff. But I mean, my job fundamentally is not to, I'm a historian. I'm in my eyes, I'm trying to be a storyteller and to tell, stories. And, but some of the stories, like the Chemical Wedding, which is a great foundational Rosicrucian document, or, Zanoni, which is a great 19th century story, or, Faust, this initiatory literature is just so profound and so interesting. And there is there, there is a lot of interesting stuff you can come across, but I'm pretty sober these days when it comes to a lot of the other stuff. It's like,
And how did you get to this subject of research? Because it's called esoteric for a reason. It's quite niche. How did you become interested in this stuff?
Yeah. So like you said, the word itself means, only understood by a few, esoteric. And, but my sort of personal, journey came from, during my bachelor's degree. This is like 2018. I was going to University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I studied biological anthropology and religious studies. And the anthropological literature was very interesting because that exposed me to a lot of literature on rites of passage and rituals of initiation, cross-cultural stuff. And we had courses just dedicated to those, and I found that very interesting, looking at, rituals like in sub-Saharan Africa and Central America that involved like extreme amounts of pain and humiliation and all this, and to be, part of the group, Joseph Campbell's work is also very interesting about this, very charismatic speaker. And so I was very interested in the sort of initiation rituals, and then the religious studies literature exposed me to very interesting stuff about the ancient mystery schools and the work of Mircea Eliade, the most important, in my eyes, historian of religions, who wrote a great series of volumes called Patterns in Comparative Religion, and also The Quest and The Forge and the Crucible, which is all about alchemy. And he was a huge influence on me, and also the works of Carl Jung, who is a great, initiate, I would say, into numinous mysteries, and the profundity of his works, surpass a lot of other things. And so and so I also had a sort of simultaneous experience, a personal experience, happening in my dream life at that time, sort of very interesting prophetic dreams I was trying to make sense of, and I found the language of psychoanalysis very helpful for that personally. And so that led me to Jung, and then further deeper into, the mysteries. And then I was like, oh, well, great. Like, is there a sort of graduate level, way to study the mysteries, in a sort of scientific way, in a historical way? So yeah, Amsterdam, it turns out, is the best place to study these traditions at a graduate level, because of this collection, because of the Bibliotheca Philosophica Hermetica collection. And there are a few other places you can study esotericism. For example, I know in Paris, that was actually, I think, the first academic chair dedicated to studying it. Antoine Favre is the father there. And also Stockholm now, you can study it. That center was founded by a previous student of the Amsterdam school. Also, I believe in Copenhagen, there's quite some work happening. And also in South Carolina, there's a new center for the study of occult sciences, and in Texas. Now, those I think offer the most sort of dedicated study to these things. Other places you can take maybe minors or a single course or something, but oftentimes those professors and researchers end up inevitably coming to Amsterdam because of this collection. So that's the significance of this collection. But to get back to the sort of personal interest was that I had these dreams that I found very interesting, that the language of psychoanalysis helped me navigate, and that was also sort of influenced by 3 extremely powerful psychedelic experiences I had. And that's another rabbit hole. And for that, I would actually point people to the work of Christian Greer, he's like the most important, probably current scholar in the West studying psychedelic movements. And that's another sort of domain in esotericism, very interesting. But yeah, that's sort of what led me here, and did the master's and then started the PhD a couple of years ago, and, got offered a contract by this institution. So now I get to, really live the dream of, get to communicate this information like on podcasts like this, and also research it and have a job, kind of,
Amazing. So actually, I think there's been also research done about psychedelic experiences in the past, right? Looking at the Bible, seeing if certain things might have been influenced by psychedelic experiences.
Yeah, Brian Murarescu is probably who you were referring to, The Immortality Key, a book that came out a few years ago. And Christian, my colleague, he knows the author, and sort of sort of teased him a bit because he was, I think, frustrated at one point that his book wasn't being taken seriously by academics. And I think it was the style he used. He sort of wrote it like a mystery novel in a way, and rather than a sort of the academic approach. Now, I haven't read the book to be frank, but there's also very interesting work. Christian Greer and Eric Davis. Eric Davis wrote a really beautifully written work called Technosis, which is all about myth, magic, and mysticism in the age of information. And that's a brilliant book. And he also did a lot of work on psychedelic movements, I think. But the question of the use of psychedelic substances in antiquity, that is way out of my expertise, but it's a fun conversation, because, these things didn't appear out of nowhere with Timothy Leary in the 1950s. They may be, responsible for all of our religious traditions for all we know, and there is some interesting discussion in the Soma of the Vedas, which was like one of these potions or something that, may have been some sort of LSD derivative substance, mushroom carvings on, stones all over the world. There's got to be something there. Terence McKenna is a great voice in this area.
And so when you're reading the books in this place, there's some amazing knowledge in there. To what extent do you look at it from an academic perspective in the way of this is just historical fact that we have to look at? And in what sense do you look at it from there's actually some knowledge to be gained here?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's also this joke in sort of circles around esoteric, the academic study of esoteric traditions, is that, a lot of these people would wear white lab coats if the university allowed us to, because people are like, oh, I'm so objective, I have no agenda, I'm totally, separate from what I'm studying. And it's like, yeah, maybe. I mean, part of it's probably a little, sort of yes and both sort of story. Like a lot of the images that I'll show you after in some of these, precious Rosicrucian manuscripts we have they're clearly about something very, profound and, interesting and so forth. How much, like we have these Rosicrucian manuscripts from the 18th century that are beautifully illustrated and very complex. And there's all, reference to wisdom and alchemical principles and things. And there's definitely a there, but also maybe you need to sort of be steeped in a specific tradition to fully appreciate a lot of the content of that kind of thing. And that's where it sort of lands a bit flat sometimes for me, where I'm not exactly sure how to appreciate this, and it's...
I wanted to ask you something about that, because we're living in a very secular age, and And all these books were written, well, in a time where people were way more in touch with spirituality, I would say. And is it therefore, maybe you already answered this a bit, but maybe you could go further into it, if it's difficult to comprehend these texts sometimes when you're living in an age where we have kind of lost our spirituality in that sense?
Yes, absolutely. Especially researching early modern material, 17th century, it's like it's so distant. How much can I really relate to this author? But the further you read, into history, you get a bigger picture and appreciation for how things developed. The scientific revolution, did a tremendous work on our appreciation for a lot of these ideas. Whenever, you cleave the subject from the object so strongly, like the scientific revolution did, and, the whole Cartesian, worldview, this mechanistic worldview, it resulted in a great loss of, an artistic worldview. I mean, maybe that's not the best way to put it, but, in the past, everything was connected. Everything had its association, and so whenever also globalization, that is a big consequence too. It's like, you start to introduce a animal or a food into a context that has no associational knowledge with that thing. That is a sort of explosion of sorts to how people relate to things. And you can only get glimpses of it. There's some really good work about this. William Ashworth wrote a great article called The Emblematic Worldview. And that gives you some idea of how people used to relate to these things in the past. How much can we really capture that worldview? It's limited, but there's certainly ways to approach it, because, there is a lot of interesting discussion in religious experience literature about how people phenomenologically experience the beatific vision, the mystical experience. And that is a great insight into, I think, into how people related to all reality in the past. So if you look at the work of William James, who wrote in, I think, 1907, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and the work of Sally B. King and others, it's not that complicated. It's like the universal thing people report when they go through mystical experience is the inability to distinguish between subject and object. So that's the whole monistic, all is one, message that the mystics have been talking about forever.
Yeah.
It's like, that is what it turns out to be. But now the scientific revolution, it's like, no, it's a dualistic conception. There's an objective world out there, and you are separate from it. You are the perceiver. To put it, briefly. But
I think a lot of, let me say it differently, like in the past, and I think a theme of this place as well is that spirituality and science were kind of connected. Was that because of a lack of knowledge that we have now, or is it just because of a whole different worldview? Because I feel like a lot of these texts are being dismissed on the fact that, but today we have this certain knowledge, so we can dismiss this, but maybe it's just a different stratum of knowledge. I don't know how far that actually comes to the truth, or if there's, I think the thing I'm trying to get to is we have this sense of what some would call like the Church of Progress, that somehow over these centuries we've become better and better and stuff, and that us today are the epitome of what humans can be. Like, we're the most intelligent, we have the best healthcare because we have smartphones, we're the most intelligent. And we kind of look down on people in the past, and I think therefore it's easier to dismiss those writings. And I don't know, do you look at it like that as well, or do you actually see there's some other knowledge in there that we just, like, we can't grasp?
There's the student of Antoine Favre, who's the sort of father of the study of esotericism. The student of his is a man called Wouter Hanegraaff, who founded the chair in Amsterdam dedicated to studying these traditions. And his narrative is that these are forms of rejected knowledge. So it's a sort of epistemological observation that there isn't a single kind of knowledge, and that, there are different forms of knowledge, but what all these are, what they have in common is that they were all rejected. They were excluded from the universities, and also this sort of Church of Progress idea you mentioned. There's a lot of interesting metrics. You can sort of discuss about it, but there is this idea. On the one hand, things are better than they've ever been. Infant mortality. So the Steven Pinker narrative that everything's getting better on paper, and like there is something to that. But there's also this sort of Kali Yuga narrative, to use the Hindu metaphor, that we're in this sort of age of decadence and consumerism and materialism, and there's like depressing metrics about people have a loss of meaning. They don't have these grand narratives that they relate to anymore, and that's related to in some people's view, this postmodern wave that is made us skeptical of grand narratives. And Nietzsche pointed this out,
yes,
quite a long time ago, that the collapse of the metaphysical structure will result in nihilism, and that's going to result in the deaths of millions of people. And in fact,
do you think there's some sort of solace to be found in the texts that are here about spirituality and a connectedness of everything?
I think what I get from a lot of these texts, and what keeps me coming back, is a sense of wonder, not a sense of certainty or gratification that I've acquired, or possessed something I didn't have before. And that's really something beautiful about Rosicrucian literature, is that something that's interesting and frustrating and intoxicating about a lot of initiatory literature, and I've found it mostly in Rosicrucianism. So, for example, The Chemical Wedding, which is one of these foundational manifestos published by the Rosicrucians, it ends abruptly, right in the height of mystery. And similarly, you go to a poem, I think written by Goethe, where he discusses the Rosy Cross, and that also ends abruptly just before something is revealed. And then in Zanoni, a book by Edward Bulwer-Lytton, which is a great work of Rosicrucian fiction, 19th century, there's this great scene where Mejnour, who is a sort of master to Zanoni's apprentice, and Mejnour is in this scene where he leads the reader to this edge of their knowledge and is about to reveal this profound, transformative secret, and then at the last moment cuts off abruptly, leaving you, wanting the completion of the previous sentence, And this was only discussed, as far as I know, by a single person, the work of Carlos Gili, who's the major, god of Rosicrucian scholarship, in an article he wrote called The Emergence of the Geheime Figuren, the emergence of the secret symbols, these Rosicrucian manuscripts. There is an author from the 18th century called Georg von Welling that Gili writes about, and Welling discusses this device that's used in this literature that, just before this, the gateway of secrets is opened and, everything is satisfied on behalf of the reader, the author cuts off abruptly, leaving the reader in deep musings, and it inspires a sense of wonder in the reader and allows the reader to sort of come to their own conclusions.
You think that was the aim of the text?
I don't know. I can only speculate, but I find it interesting and frustrating, but also it befuddles and confuses you and leads you in deeper into the the whole mystery rabbit hole, And for me, it's a sense of wonder, that I appreciate, and I think the images that come out of these traditions are very beautiful.
I mean, talking about those images, I would love to talk to you about the one you have here, The Head, I think it's called, maybe by Robert
Flood.
That one. Yeah. I would love to hear you explain that one, because to the people listening, they might not know what it looked like. So if you could explain that and your view on it.
So, yes, so this is a famous image. It's a beautiful image. It's from early 17th century by an English philosopher, hermetic philosopher, and polymath called Robert Flood. And Flood is mostly remembered for his extremely voluminous works here. These are the entire collected works of Flood.
Okay.
Extremely prolific author, and also a nemesis of Kepler, the astronomer. And Flood has chapters in his volumes dedicated to a lot of different topics. One's about, geomancy, about mechanics, about music, about alchemy, many, many topics. And this image you refer to is from a chapter dedicated to the esoteric doctrine, many would call a pseudoscience now, of physiognomy. And physiognomy, does that ring any bells for you?
No, it doesn't.
So physiognomy was the, practice of reading people's faces. The idea that the lineaments and proportions of the face and the expression of certain emotions develop certain muscles and indicates and results in the idea that your face reveals your personality, your character, your spiritual situation. The idea is really that the face and the body is a reflection of the soul. And this face, Jocelyn Godwin writes about this, that it represents a sort of eugenic ideal, of a perfect, most enlightened, face. What the most enlightened face might look like if it was absolutely perfect. It's got really full lips and it's got like all these, perfectly proportioned, features according to Flood. I don't know if we would find this an attractive face, now is, but
beauty standards change.
Yeah. And also the image shows how the brain acquires knowledge. And so first there is the mundus sensibilis, I believe. So the sensible world. And then the mundus imaginabilis.
That's the one.
Yeah, the imaginal.
That's it.
So this idea that the world that can be imagined, that's also important for him. And then Flood also has the mundus intellectualis, so the intellectual world, which evidently was the most important for him. That's where he puts God, the Father, and the Son. So it's a sort of it's a Trinitarian idea he uses, these different worlds that the mind interacts with, the sensible world, the imaginal world, and the intellectual world. And it's also, indicates, where the memory is stored and these kind of things. And it's, of course, an antiquated, inaccurate, cognitive scientists would probably have a field day with this piece, but it's an attempt, to try to explain things in a certain age. And now, but Flood is a monumental figure. He was incredibly frustrated with the emergence of what was called the new science, which we call science now. Empiricism, which was natural philosophy. And Flood thought that the scientific worldview was totally destroying this prior worldview that was much more inclusive of the idea that everything is connected. And Flood is a great example of that. So that's a great image.
Are you ever because for me personally, that happens all the time when I look around here at the images and stuff. Are you sometimes just in awe of what people hundreds of years ago were able to think of and able to create?
Absolutely. I am an intellectual historian, what's called, and so I study the ideas, and it's just absolutely, mind-blowing. And it really, provides you with a sense of wonder about, people put a tremendous amount of care and effort into trying to figure things out, and, Flood's a great example of that. He was, he's been described as the last man who knew everything, in an age where you probably could know everything, or, at least make a stalwart attempt at it. But the images which I focus on for my research, that's really what drew me in, these captivating images. Like, what are these about? What are they communicating? They're portals into another dimension, basically. They're really into another time, into another, view of the world. And so that's what history is so important for, because history it's such a boring, the majority of, history, of historians' approach to telling history is just, history is a horror show. History is full of blood and death and tragedy, and so, the pretty images we have here is a much, more maybe approachable way to studying a period that was very dynamic and very interesting, and all kinds of ideas were coming up and new words and new things. And so this collection is quite unique for that,
You just mentioned something that I find interesting is that, I'm paraphrasing here, but that basically these people spend a lot of time trying to figure out the world. They spend a lot of time researching. And just because of that, I already think it's worth diving into these amazing texts, just because a lot of people nowadays might dismiss it from a standpoint of it doesn't fit with modern science, but the fact that these people spent such an incredible amount of time making these incredible illustrations, writing books before printing presses were invented, just in a search for meaning, what it meant to them. Already because of that, it's so worth to just come visit the museum for sure, and just have a look at all these writings.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, because Wouter Hanegraaff has an article about how, esotericism, the practitioners of these traditions, have been derided as the losers of history, but I mean, I couldn't withstand the onslaught of the Apology by Plato, which is a very short text. If you can survive that text and emerge a total secular atheist rational, good luck, because some of these texts are absolutely transformative.
Can you explain the text that you just mentioned?
The Apology by Plato, that is the recounting of the trial that Socrates went through. So Socrates, who was Plato's teacher, who never wrote anything down, and now it's so monumental is this figure that everything before Socrates is referred to as pre-Socratic philosophy. So something really changed with Socrates. But the Apology is the trial that Socrates went through, which he was eventually convicted because Socrates was charged with corrupting the youth of Athens and for believing in gods other than the state. And that trial really communicates the depth and how profound language can be. It's and I'm reading in the English translation also, and so Socrates was convicted of these crimes after a defense, that was absolutely incredible, and convicted to death for these crimes. And Socrates was always going to the marketplace, asking the soldiers if they were really virtuous and asking prodding, annoying questions to people. And Socrates was the wisest man in Athens, according to the Delphic oracle. He visited the Apollo at the temple of Apollo. They had this oracle, and Socrates visited them. And Socrates asked who the wisest man in Athens was, and the oracle said, "You, Socrates, are the wisest man." And Socrates said, "That cannot be because I don't know anything." And the oracle basically said, "Precisely.
That's why."
And we're sort of, I'm jumping a bit here, but then the Rosicrucians, they are very much putting forward whatever Plato revealed, because they say that the height of knowledge is to know nothing, and that's straight out of Plato, straight from Socrates, that he was the wisest man in Athens because he knew that he knew nothing, and that's a great, and so the Apology is wonderful, but just, I try to give the authors the benefit of the doubt, and, a lot of it wouldn't measure up to the rigorousness of empirical science. But I think there's a great harmony in a lot of the books, actually, that you can unite a lot of the findings of these books with, the findings of. It's not totally separate.
No.
Like, people may think. There is, a lot of the things that were discovered in these texts were developed, refined, and, now, if you go to Frances Yates's narrative, she says that science didn't result in spite of these texts. Science resulted because of these traditions. Like, we have science now because of these books, these authors. So that's one narrative.
Amazing. Actually, during the time of Plato, were they already aware of Hermetic philosophy, or was that not around at that time yet?
Now, this is a question for Dylan Burns, the antiquity specialist at Amsterdam, and but the and some of the history, as far as I know, of this period, does blend in with mythological history a bit. We began with a discussion of Ficino and the translation of the Hermetic texts. Now, in the 17th century, I think 1651, a very sober classical philologist, actually critically analyzed the Hermetica, the Corpus Hermeticum, and determined that they could not have been written any earlier than the 2nd century, actually, which totally destroyed this ancient, Egypt narrative, at least for the text that Ficino had. Now, there is also the discussion that the Hermetic text that Ficino received were based on, that was already a translation from much older texts that were written in the original Coptic, because the ones he gets were in Greek, Now, that we're not sure of. We also don't know if Hermes was a individual or a school or a, symbol for the philosophy in ancient Egypt. But I think Wouter Hanegraaff, in his most recent book on hermetic spirituality and the historical imagination, writes that he speculates, I'm not sure how strongly, I haven't read the book in its entirety, that there was a hermetic school in Egypt, we're quite sure of, and even some of the practitioners or devotees of the school have been identified. So, for example, Iamblichus, who wrote on the mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians, the first real cross-cultural analysis of the ancient mystery schools, and Zalzimos of Panopolis, who wrote, he's famous for these visions of Zalzimos, which are these very puzzling dream visions that are also alchemical. So Zalzimos, Iamblichus, and Wouter points out another one that escapes me at the moment. But his conviction is that there was this ancient hermetic school in Egypt, and there were at least a few people we can identify as being followers of the school.
Where does the Emerald Tablet come into that story?
So the Emerald Tablet is where this famous "as above, so below" line comes from, that people may have heard. It begins, "That which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above," to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. It's a very short text, about 10 lines. It's called the Bible of the Alchemists, and it's originally a 9th century Arabic text that gets translated into Greek and Latin later on. And this is a bit of a puzzle, and I'm not sure exactly how it relates to Egypt, but it's called the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. And in many of the images we have, you have the text of the Emerald Tablet, or you have a imagistic depiction of it. I'll show you quite a famous one afterwards. And but it's a puzzling, cryptic text that can be interpreted, many ways. There's the whole materialistic interpretation of the alchemist, but then it's also referring to this microcosm, macrocosm idea, which is a sort of fractal idea. And there is some interesting discussion about how, perennial that idea is. If everything is fundamentally a fractal, there's a lot of things we discovered thousands and thousands of years ago that are still as true now as they were then. And I think many people would say the Emerald Tablet text is one of these perennial truths that it reveals.
You mentioned the alchemy part. That was a part of Hermeticism is alchemy, right?
Yes, so Hermes is called the sort of the father of alchemy, and the father of the philosophers, and this is related to the visions of Zalzimos, actually, because Zalzimos, as far as we know, at least one of the earliest known alchemists we are quite sure about, he writes these visions where he also depicts alchemical equipment that were being used at that time in Egypt. And so Hermes, the hermetic science is alchemy. Now, yeah.
The most famous part of alchemy is, of course, like turning base metals into gold, I think it is, right?
This is one of the ambitions.
There's more to alchemy than just that, right?
So yeah, the alchemists were, on the one hand, the founders of chemistry. They were doing dangerous experimentation, and I would point people to the work of Lawrence Principe and Bill Newman, who wrote many, many important histories of the emergence of chemistry from alchemy, and they take a very strict historical analysis of this. They're chemists and historians, these guys. They're really at Johns Hopkins University. Now, there's been a sort of counter narrative saying, okay, they emphasize the materialistic approach to alchemy a bit too much, because they say, the vast majority of alchemical, pursuit was about the transformation of matter. It was about material pursuits, which they were responding to the Jungian interpretation that says, alchemy was fundamentally about the transformation of the alchemist.
That's what I always thought. I thought with alchemy, I always thought it was more of a metaphor of turning maybe your soul into spiritual gold or something.
Right, and there's a recent book by Mike Zuber called Spiritual Alchemy, From Jacob Boehme to Marianne Atwood, which details the spiritual alchemical tradition from the 16th century, actually in the works of Jacob Boehme. But he actually traces it earlier than that to what's called the pseudo-Weigelian corpus. And so this is referring to Valentin Weigel, who was a German mystic. And when historians say pseudo-Weigel or pseudo-Plato or pseudo-Hermes, it's someone that's reading the authentic, Plato or Weigel, and then writing their own works and signing it with the original author's name. So this is referred to as the pseudo-Weigel alchemical corpus. And Zuber points out the beginnings of a spiritual alchemical tradition in the 16th century in this pseudo-Weigelian corpus that then gets received by Jakob Böhme, who uses alchemical imagery and symbolism to refer to something clearly not material, all through to Marianne Atwood. And that's a really great story maybe to
Please explain.
Yeah, so Marianne Atwood, which Mike Zuber's book finishes with, she was a researcher, an author, who wrote this very important book called A Suggestive Inquiry into the Hermetic Mystery. And this is a great story. People should look into this further. It's a great thing to look into. Marianne Atwood was the daughter of a man called Thomas South, and they jointly wrote many sort of esoteric works, but the most important was this one I mentioned, A Suggestive Inquiry. And that book they had finished. This is actually a modern copy. We have one of the originals. And I just want to actually, I'm glad this came up. I want to read how she begins that book with this very short paragraph. From remote antiquity and through successive intervals in the higher spheres of mind, the tradition of an art has circulated, but so dark and enigmatical as to evade vulgar apprehension entirely and baffle the most acute. Now this book, which you can see is quite voluminous, she and her father brought to the printer and began to print the book, and then went home, and then in a moment of lucidity, rushed back to the printer and purchased every existing copy and brought them home and burned every copy because they thought that they had revealed too much of the Hermetic mystery. Now, 2 of these copies had survived. One was in the possession of one of her friends she loaned it to, and the other one I think she kept, I'm not sure, but one of the surviving copies we have just up there.
Wait, so it's the surviving copy from the batch that they bought and tried to destroy, pretty much?
Right, yes.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's, so people can look into that. I think it's maybe even available on archive.org.
What's the difference between the surviving one and the one that came, the official version after?
No, I think the copies, like these modern copies we have, I think they're pretty faithful to the original.
Okay.
As far as I know, and I'm not an expert in Atwood, okay. But she, Atwood, is the 9th century manifestation of of a spiritual understanding to alchemy. Okay. And then it gets picked up by Ethan Allen Hitchcock, who wrote another book on a spiritual, moral approach to alchemy, that it's all about morality. And then the other 2 famous authors, the most famous is Carl Jung, of course, who wrote the Psychology and Alchemy volumes, and a colleague of Jung's who does not get much attention, but should, a guy called Herbert Silberer, who wrote a book called Problems of Mysticism and Its Symbolism. And he begins that book, which is a total exploration of psychological alchemy with a reference to a Rosicrucian story from the 17th century. So there is a spiritual alchemical tradition. Mike Zuber proved that. It's a minor tradition. It's not as big as the, chemical alchemy that goes at least back to the 16th century. And that's even influenced by antiquity writings by, I think, Valentinius, which was a Gnostic author, but I'm not certain about that. But Mike Zuber's book, Spiritual Alchemy, from Jakob Böhme to Marianne Atwood, that's a great book. It's available now. It was one of the most recent PhDs published from the University of Amsterdam. And his advisor is Peter Forshaw, who's another very important scholar of alchemy and my PhD advisor, and a great human. And people should look into the work of Peter Forshaw also.
We've discussed so many topics now, and they're all kind of connected in some sort of way, which you beautifully describe. But I can imagine that the people listening might be getting a bit dizzy by all the subjects that we're covering. So let's say all the knowledge about esotericism is wiped from your brain and you have to start over. What pathway would you suggest for people and for yourself then in that situation to get into this esoteric tradition?
A really good question. Where to begin? There's a few great, introductions. Jocelyn Godwin wrote a very approachable book called The Golden Thread, which I think the subtitle is like The Timeless Wisdom of Antiquity. And that's a short book, and there's chapters dedicated to all these, Prisca Theologia traditions. And that's a popular one. That's a great one. If you want to read further and read some more primary stuff, I would recommend reading the Rosicrucian Manifestos, the Fama Fraternitatis, Confessio Fraternitatis, and the Chemical Wedding, or just read the Chemical Wedding. That's also quite approachable. Other introductory material. There's a ton of free content on YouTube. I mean, geez, you can listen to so much good stuff. Robert Gilbert is a very important recent popularizer of Rosicrucianism, from a more sort of he's quite a rigorous historian, but also appreciates a lot of the things in his own way. There's lectures that we offer here at the Embassy of the Free Mind that people can watch online from home, and those are often quite introductory level and historical. We're not trying to convert you to any particular movement. No. We're just trying to be a platform for ideas. There's so much, and without coming off as too biased, I would say, the Jocelyn Godwin book is a good introductory one. If people are more interested into modern movements, Henrik Bogdan wrote a book called Rituals of Initiation and Western Esotericism. Antoine Favre, actually, that's another good one that we have here. This is Access to Western Esotericism, which is another
sounds like a good start
volume, and it goes over the commonalities shared by all the traditions, like living nature and correspondence.
That's actually something I wanted to ask you about. Is there any, in all the research that you've done, is there any threads you can see throughout traditions, religions, that comes back a lot?
Definitely. Now, as a historian, it's all sort of, you have to be careful because, just because, for example, I'm not saying this is what they said, but if Plato says the same thing as, Alfred North Whitehead, or, this may be not a good example, but if Plato said the same thing as, like, Confucius, that doesn't mean one was a student of the other. You can come to the same conclusion, without being historically connected. And some would say that's the perennial philosophy shining through, coming to the same conclusion. And so, for example, this golden rule idea, treat others as you would like to be treated. That was also saying it Confucius, it was not just unique to the Western canon, and so there are certain things that do recur. This idea that the whole goal of mysticism is, the dissolving of the object and subject, That's very simply put. It's like the EMC squared of the history of mysticism. It's like, that's what a lot of mystics are after, and they may use different language to describe it, but phenomenologically, they're after the oneness, the monistic all is one experience. So you don't have to know a lot. You don't have to read a lot to come to these conclusions. You don't have to be educated at all, and that's something I think a lot of people in the field of, esotericism are too lost in the most recent sort of theoretical, approach, or, they lose the forest for the trees, and it's like, we're supposed to be humanists, we're supposed to be like, communicators of, these ideas, not just sitting in an ivory tower talking to 10 people that can understand you, so I'm trying to, and I'm very much a student, my advisor, Peter Forshaw, who's brilliant at this. I'm trying to write and speak, maybe I hope it's coming across that way, in a way that anybody could appreciate, not just someone that's like a student of, one of these traditions, but, people have different approaches. Yeah.
Is there maybe it's probably a very difficult question, but is there a favorite book in the collection of yours?
Zanoni is great. Zanoni is underappreciated. Edward Bulwer-Lytton's masterpiece, I would say, 19th century. This is on archive.org. You can access it online. It's a narrative, fiction narrative. It's a novel, and really deep insights. Zanoni's great. That's pretty long. If you want just a sort of a short, confusing entrance, in a proper initiation, baptism by fire style, read The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosicrucianism.
Mm-hmm.
That's a puzzling document. 17th century, it's like 1610 or so, it was composed. And strangely enough, Carl Jung begins his final Mysterium Conjunctionis, which is all about alchemy and psychology. He begins that book with a discussion of The Chemical Wedding. And that I was like, how does this influence the history of psychoanalysis?
Everything's connected.
So exactly. So The Chemical Wedding, that's another fun thing that and it's another book I really love, influenced me a lot. And then actually this book Herbert Silber wrote called Problems of Mysticism and its Symbolism. That's another great one.
So
there's so much.
You're actually quite knowledgeable about Carl Jung. Quite knowledgeable.
He was a big influence on me, Carl Jung.
Amazing. I saw that you have his red book here as well.
Of course. Yes.
Did you ever go through that? Did you?
I'm saving the red book for when I'm in my 70s, I think. I'm interested, Carl Jung is one of these characters, I mean, his academic stuff, like Man and His Symbols, or Psychology and Alchemy, or The Undiscovered Self, those are quite approachable, if you have some familiarity with the language of psychoanalysis. He does his homework. He knew a lot of languages. He was a deeply learned person. Now the red book, we would call a primary source. The books I just referred to are secondary sources. They are more academic, they're more historical, more rational. The red book is his revelation. It's a prophetic work. It's his encounter with his unconscious and the beings he encountered in his unconscious over decades. I think it was recorded, these encounters. And the red book we have is a great copy because it has the scholarly introduction and translation work by Sonu Shamdasani, the foremost historian of Jung now, who was able to befriend and gain the trust of the Jung family, which allowed the publication of the red book, because it wasn't actually ever published in his life.
How recently was it published?
2009.
2009.
Yeah, and then the red book is a distillation of the black books, and the black books are where Jung recorded his encounters with these archetypes of his unconscious. And the black books were published like 2 years ago, so even most recently. And those are all it has facsimile, so you can see his handwriting and his doodles. And the red book will be written about, and PhDs will be done about the red book for perhaps the next 200 years. My advisor is supervising a PhD at the moment about the red book and Dante, and this sort of parallel investigation into the depths, that Dante uses a similar metaphor. And people like Jordan Peterson have acknowledged what Jung did with the red book as the most important conceptual happening in the 20th century, because what Jung did, according to this, was that he brought the conceptual domain and the mythological domain together for the first time. So it's hard to communicate what exactly he meant by that, but I guess I think I'll leave it there.
I mean, a thread through a lot of work that's here, I think, is that what I have with Jung is that I don't fully grasp it, don't fully understand it, but somehow it kind of internally makes sense. And I think that's the case with a lot of work here. It doesn't necessarily, for example, the image that we talked about with the minds, you don't fully have to understand what it actually is for it to still, maybe it comes back to the wonder you talked about, to appreciate the wonder in it. And I think that's maybe a thread through everything now that we've talked for about an hour, that from 2,000 years ago to Jung writing, less than 100 years ago, it's still that wonder that comes through and everything, looking for the answers, sometimes even looking for the same answers that people were looking for 2,000 years ago, which really leads me to the thought that maybe it really is about that wonder. Maybe it's not about the actual answers. And I don't know how you feel about that. Maybe because to me it really relates to maybe even existentialism in a certain way.
Definitely.
That it's not the fact that the answers that we're looking for that are gonna fulfill us. It's more the fact that you're looking for them. And I think that's what a lot of writers were doing here. That
Absolutely. And, I think what what a lot of the authors inspire me in me, and what the images do and what the visitors do, it's a sense of wonder. It's not a sense of certainty and, being sure. It's really about this openness to ideas and perspectives and things that is a very healthy thing that people tend to lose, the sense of awe, that, you know, people still get it, going into a mosque or going into a cathedral, this like overwhelming sense of beauty and wonder, and you get that in other ways, sport and dance and, gastronomy, sexuality. These things offer this sort of like, greater than you sort of experience, and it puts you in the moment, and so I think that, and certainly for Jung, he saw, the writings of the alchemists as continuity between the ancient Gnostics and the moderns. And so, in that view, there is this thread, there is this, continuity. We aren't just fallen and separate from everything that happened before. We are the, products of the strivings of our ancestors. And, it's so, in that view, there is this sort of thing that we are continuing.
do you think that modern academics maybe has, in some sense, maybe divided the subject and the object too much?
I would say, and I'm very critical of academic culture in many ways. It can be overeducated. People can be overeducated, and the worship of abstraction, I think, has gone too far. People are so convinced of their theories and their, but abstraction is not, the in my view, and this is where I'm taking my historian cap off and revealing my sort of personal feelings about this. I think it's like, if you have to explain why something is beautiful, it's not, and if you have to explain why, why you're convinced by a certain thing, and to put it generally, I think that the worship of abstraction has gone too far, and I think we need to remember that we are humans, and we should champion humanism again. It's not a new idea; it's a very old idea. And to wear a coat of many colors, to use the biblical idea, and to be open-minded, and to see that you are a fellow sufferer, and so is the person you're with, and you should try to be a little more kind, like Aldous Huxley said. After all the reading Huxley did, he said, the ultimate conclusion I come to and to tell people is to treat others with a little more kindness. And that's, I think, a great idea.
That's a great way of looking at it. And I think what a lot of writers did from the books that are here is that they were looking internally a lot, which leads me to the last subject I want to discuss with you. And I don't know how much you know about it, but I would love to know some more about Gnosticism, which, as far as I know, is a sort of stream of Christianity about 2,000 years ago that really, to put it very simply, put more focus on looking for God internally than externally, which is why the church wasn't very happy with them, because, of course, if you're not looking for God externally, then there's nobody that can have power over you. Is that even correct, what I'm saying, or?
No, I think that's pretty accurate, actually. You've done your homework. And it's another area that I have to admit my ignorance. Dylan Burns at the University of Amsterdam is a great scholar of Gnosticism. He can read the text, for one thing. And right, so they were the first sort of branch of Christianity that broke from the main tradition. And it's also an interesting story because in, I believe, 1945, there was this discovery made of the Nag Hammadi Gnostic scriptures in Egypt. It's another nice story because what was discovered there, I think it was a boy playing in the sand, and discovered these vases filled with thousands of papyri scrolls. And I want to say, and the details aren't right, but this is the gist, is that the boy's father, not knowing what was discovered, these were writings dealing with a different situation, of a different idea of what occurred in the Garden of Eden, agreeing on the main sort of, motifs, that there was this garden, Adam and Eve were there was the serpent, But in that narrative, the Gnostic narrative Genesis, is that the serpent was a positive figure giving knowledge. And now these were composed in the first centuries of the Common Era, in the same period when many of the Gospels were being, compiled. And the father of this boy, as far as I understand it, not knowing what was discovered, what was the content of these precious manuscripts, burned several of these documents to stay warm overnight, resulting in the loss of, we'll never know.
Oh, no.
But many of these were preserved, the bulk of them. And also an important difference from the main Christian tradition, as far as I know, is the veneration of the feminine. They worship Sophia, whereas, main Christian, it's all about the Father and the Son, and the Gnostics, so the serpent is a positive figure. They worship Sophia. And as you say, it was a more internal church, and that's another commonality in a lot of our books. They are inner traditions. That's another great way to put it. I mean, there are, rituals and some of the, traditions that the books represent. There are these outer manifestations, but it's a much more individual approach. The answers are within you kind of idea. And I'm pretty sure that's one of the main teachings of the Gnostics. But again, do your research. I'm not an expert on this stuff.
No. Okay. There's another thing I would like to discuss, but it escapes me right now. I did want to come back to the Nag Hammadi library that you mentioned. What I found so fascinating about that is that, and I have to look at my notes here, is that they found a jar, right, with all these sealed scrolls.
Okay, yeah.
And they contained Gnostic treatises and works relating to the Corpus Hermeticum, but also part of Plato's Republic. And to me, that's so fascinating that nowadays we were probably, out of those three, we would take Plato's Republic and say, oh, that's the most important thing. But this, whoever it was that buried this, put the same value on Plato's Republic, the Corpus Hermeticum, and these Gnostic texts. That to me is just something that underlines the importance of these texts, People knew something about the importance of these, that they put them on the same level with Plato.
That's amazing. Thanks for saying that. I actually don't think I'd ever heard that before, that they were compiled with Plato and the Corpus Hermeticum. Maybe I heard that some of the Corpus Hermeticum fragments were in there. Yeah. But as you say, yeah, to equivalent, to put an equivalency between these things, that they were the authorities, according to, this tradition. And so that discovery, the Nag Hammadi scriptures, is another one of these extremely recent, yesterday sort of discoveries that will be, we're still learning about the early Christian situation because of these writings, and will be for the next however many hundreds of years, before we get the full picture, or if we ever do. But it's like the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are things waiting out there, in the sands, who knows what else is buried under the sands,
Right. To finish up, because we're running out of time here, when people come to this museum, what can they expect besides seeing these beautiful ancient books? What else can they expect when they come here?
Yes, so we have a general guided tour, which is a great way to get familiar with the content, because the museum is covered in images framed, which are images from the books. And many visitors come in and they sort of they definitely have a sense of wonder, but there can be too much of that. And they're like, where am I? What is all this stuff? How do I get my orientation? And the general tour we offer is really, really helpful for that. Also, we have a publishing house. We have a lot of books you can buy, and a nice web shop. We offer lectures once a month with experts in various fields, sometimes twice or three times a month. And these lectures vary from artificial intelligence and ChatGPT to the mysteries of antiquity and the Gnostics and alchemy and all kinds of topics. These also can be watched from home, from anywhere, and then you get the recording sent afterwards. We also have lunch concerts with conservatory musicians once a month, and these are really fantastic performances. We also have workshops for kids, craft making and things like this. And we have a cafe. We have a fantastic garden. Many people come just for the garden, in fact, with about 400 tulip bulbs planted. So if you're ever in Amsterdam and you like a coffee and a bit of wonder, come by and have a chat, and reach out. So,
yeah, it's an amazing place. So everybody should definitely go and visit. Corey, thanks so much for doing this. Thanks for taking the time, and good luck with all your research.
Thanks. Yeah, it was a pleasure. And yeah, good luck with everything here.
Thanks.